Your soulmate has an important message for you. Something happened today. Open this now. Something changed in the middle of an ordinary day, so quietly that almost nobody noticed it. But somewhere, behind a closed door, your soulmate sat completely still, staring at a message they had written, deleted, and written again. Their hands stopped over the screen. Their expression changed. And for the first time, they realized that staying silent was becoming harder than telling you the truth. You may not know what happened today, but something shifted inside them. A thought they had been pushing away suddenly became impossible to ignore. And the strangest part? The message they want to send you isn't really about what happened today. It's about something they've been carrying for much longer. So stay with this, because the moment they finally decided what to say reveals why today became different from every other day. Earlier, everything looked normal. The usual routine. The usual conversations. People moving around them without realizing that their mind was somewhere else entirely. Then something reminded them of you. Maybe it was a familiar song playing quietly in the background. Maybe they saw something that instantly brought your face to mind. Or maybe someone casually mentioned a detail that only you would understand. Whatever it was, their attention disappeared from the room for a moment. They remembered a conversation between the two of you. Not the words everyone else would remember, the little things. The pause before you answered. The way you looked at them when you thought they weren't paying attention. The feeling they had after the conversation ended. And suddenly, today's events began connecting to something they had been trying to understand about you. That's when the thought became clear: I need to tell them. But there was one problem. They didn't know how to begin. And this is where the story takes a turn, because the first version of the message wasn't what you might expect. They didn't immediately write, "I miss you." They didn't start with a dramatic confession. Instead, they typed a simple sentence. Then stared at it for several seconds. They were trying to find a way to explain something without revealing too much too quickly. Because what happened today made them realize that their feelings weren't disappearing with time. They were becoming clearer. They started wondering whether you still think about them. Whether you ever reread old conversations. Whether you notice the small signs they leave behind. And then came the moment that stopped them completely. They opened your conversation, looked at your name, and almost pressed send. Almost. But they backed away. Why? Because the next sentence carried a truth they weren't sure they were ready for you to hear. And that sentence is exactly where everything begins to change. The screen went dark before they could press send. For a few seconds, they simply sat there, listening to the quiet around them, as if the entire room had paused with them. Then they picked up the phone again. This time, they didn't open your conversation. Instead, they went somewhere else, somewhere connected to a memory they hadn't visited in a while. A photo. An old message. A small reminder of a moment when the two of you understood each other without needing many words. And as they looked at it, their expression softened. They realized something they hadn't fully admitted before: they weren't struggling to find the right words because they had nothing to say. They were struggling because there was too much to say. Today's unexpected moment had simply brought all of it to the surface at once. And one particular realization kept returning to their mind: maybe you've been waiting for clarity just as much as they have. Then something happened that made their hesitation even harder to maintain. Someone close to them noticed the change in their mood. They asked a simple question, nothing dramatic, nothing complicated. "What's on your mind?" At first, your soulmate tried to brush it aside. They smiled slightly and said everything was fine. But the silence afterward said something completely different. Eventually, they admitted that there was someone they needed to talk to. They didn't say your name immediately. They didn't need to. The way their voice changed when they began describing the situation gave away how important it was. They explained that there was a person they couldn't simply forget, someone who had left an impression that time hadn't erased. And when they were asked what they wanted to do about it, they looked down for a moment before answering. "I think I need to be honest." That sentence carried more weight than they expected. Because honesty meant opening a door they had spent a long time keeping half closed. And once that door opened, there would be no pretending that everything was still the same. If this story is resonating with you, you can share your thoughts in the comments or simply stay connected by subscribing. Sometimes, one person's experience reminds another person that they're not alone in what they're feeling. And there was another detail about today that your soulmate couldn't stop thinking about. After that conversation, they went back to their phone. This time, they didn't hesitate as long. They began typing again, but the message was different. It started with something simple: "There's something I should have told you." They stopped. Deleted it. Tried again. "Something happened today, and it made me realize." Another pause. Their heart was clearly ahead of their words. Then they finally wrote the sentence that had been waiting underneath every other sentence: "I don't want you to misunderstand my silence." They stared at those words for a long time. Because suddenly they understood that their silence may have been saying the exact opposite of what they intended. They weren't silent because they didn't care. They had been silent because caring made the truth more difficult to explain. And now, with their finger hovering over the send button, they knew the next message could change the entire tone of your connection. But before they sent it, one unexpected memory came back to them, and this time, it made them smile. The smile lasted only a moment, but it told them everything. The memory was from a time when you had said something almost casually, something you probably didn't realize would stay with them. They remembered your exact expression, the quiet confidence in your voice, and the way you made them feel understood without demanding an explanation. Until today, they had treated that memory like a pleasant moment from the past. But now it looked different. Suddenly, they understood why it kept returning whenever they thought about you. It wasn't just nostalgia. It represented something unfinished. Something they had never properly acknowledged. They placed the phone down and walked across the room, thinking about how many times they had convinced themselves that waiting was the safer choice. But today's events had challenged that decision. For the first time, they weren't asking whether they still cared. They were asking what might happen if they finally stopped hiding it. Then came the part they hadn't expected. They began imagining your reaction. Would you be surprised? Would you believe them? Would you wonder why they waited so long? Those questions made them nervous, but they also revealed something important. They weren't afraid of sending the message itself. They were afraid of what your answer might mean. Because somewhere inside, they had already imagined a future conversation between you. They imagined sitting across from you, watching your expression change as they explained what had really been happening inside them. No rehearsed lines. No pretending everything was easy. Just honesty. And that imagined conversation made them realize the message needed to be more than an emotional impulse. It needed to be genuine. So they returned to the screen and began again. This time, they didn't delete anything. They wrote slowly, carefully, as though every sentence mattered. Today made me realize I've been waiting for the perfect moment. Then they paused. Because the next words were the ones they had been avoiding. They continued, maybe there isn't a perfect moment. Maybe there is only the moment when you're finally ready to tell someone what they mean to you. Their thumb hovered above the screen. They read it twice. Then a third time. Something about seeing those words written down made the truth feel real. This wasn't simply about missing someone. It was about recognizing the importance of a connection that had survived uncertainty, distance, hesitation, and countless unanswered questions. And here's the detail you shouldn't overlook: they weren't trying to create a dramatic moment. They were trying to create an honest one. That's why today's event mattered so much. It forced them to stop looking at your connection through the lens of fear and start looking at it through the lens of possibility. They finally understood that waiting hadn't made the feeling disappear. It had only given them more time to understand it. Then, just as they prepared to send the message, they noticed one final thing on their screen: something connected directly to you. Their expression changed instantly. They leaned closer. And what they saw made them realize that perhaps today's timing wasn't accidental at all. The thing on the screen wasn't complicated. It was small. Almost insignificant to anyone else. But to them, it carried a meaning they couldn't ignore. It was a reminder connected to you, appearing at exactly the moment they were debating whether to finally speak. They stared at it without moving, then slowly leaned back in their chair. A quiet laugh escaped them. Not because anything was funny, but because the timing felt almost unbelievable. They had spent so long searching for certainty, and now they were realizing that certainty might never arrive in the dramatic way they imagined. Sometimes it comes through a simple moment that makes you stop avoiding what you already know. Their eyes returned to the message they had written. This time, they didn't edit it. They didn't make it sound cooler, safer, or less emotional. They decided that if they were going to reach out, they wanted you to hear their real voice. And there was one sentence they added that completely changed the meaning of everything before it. They typed, "I don't know if you realize how much you've stayed on my mind." Then they stopped. Their breathing became slower. They could almost picture your face reading those words. But they kept going. "There were so many times I wanted to tell you what I was feeling, and every time I found a reason to wait." That admission felt strangely freeing. They weren't blaming circumstances. They weren't making excuses. They were finally taking responsibility for the silence. Then came the sentence they had been avoiding all day: "I think I've been afraid that if I told you the truth, everything between us would change." They read it once and felt their eyes become thoughtful. Because that was the real reason. They weren't confused about you. They were confused about what honesty might unlock. And today had forced them to confront that fear. If this story means something to you, feel free to share what part speaks to your heart, and if you enjoy stories like this, you're always welcome to subscribe and stay for what comes next. But just when they thought they had finally said everything, another memory surfaced. This one was different. It wasn't a romantic moment or some grand declaration. It was a quiet moment when you had shown patience, kindness, or understanding without expecting anything in return. And suddenly they realized that this was the part they had forgotten to tell you. They didn't only miss your presence. They missed the way they felt when they were around you. They missed feeling seen. They missed the ease of conversations that didn't need to be forced. They missed the possibility of simply being themselves. Their fingers moved across the screen again. There's something else I need you to know. They paused, then continued, you didn't become important to me because of one perfect moment. It happened slowly, through all the little moments I didn't understand at the time. Now the message was no longer a question of whether to send it. It was a question of whether they were brave enough to let you see the truth. And with that thought, they finally pressed send. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen changed. A notification appeared. Their eyes widened as they realized you had already responded. For a moment, they couldn't move. Your reply was sitting there on the screen, but they were almost afraid to open it. The room suddenly felt different. The sounds around them seemed distant, as though everything had narrowed down to one glowing notification. They had spent the entire day preparing themselves to say what they felt, imagining every possible reaction, but they hadn't prepared for you to answer so quickly. Their thumb hovered over the screen. Then they opened the message. The first few words made their expression completely change. You hadn't responded with confusion. You hadn't responded with anger. Instead, your message contained something they hadn't expected to see at all: recognition. You seemed to understand more than they thought you did. They read it once, then again, slowly. And somewhere between those two readings, their shoulders relaxed. They realized that perhaps they hadn't been the only one carrying unanswered questions. Perhaps you had been waiting for clarity too. They continued reading, and one particular sentence stopped them. You had mentioned that there were moments when you almost reached out yourself, but something always made you hesitate. That admission hit differently. Suddenly, the silence between you didn't look like rejection anymore. It looked like two people standing on opposite sides of the same uncertainty, both wondering who would take the first step. Your soulmate placed the phone against their chest for a few seconds and closed their eyes. The relief on their face was impossible to hide. Then they smiled, not the nervous smile from earlier, but something warmer. Something genuine. They realized today's message had accomplished something bigger than simply starting a conversation. It had broken a pattern. For so long, both of you may have been interpreting silence through your own fears. Now there was finally a chance to replace assumptions with actual words. And as they began typing their response, they decided they wouldn't hide behind vague statements anymore. This time, they wanted you to understand exactly what today's realization had been. They wrote that something about today had made them look at the connection differently. Not because everything suddenly became perfect, but because they finally understood what they had been protecting themselves from. They had been afraid of caring too deeply, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid that saying too much would somehow make the connection disappear. But your response gave them a different perspective. Maybe honesty wasn't something that destroyed meaningful connections. Maybe honesty revealed which connections were strong enough to grow. They told you there was no pressure to answer anything immediately. They simply wanted you to know the truth they had struggled to express. Then they added one final thought: whatever happens next, I'm glad I finally told you. They stared at those words before sending them. This time, there was no hesitation. The message went through. And just when they thought the biggest moment of the day had already happened, your next response appeared almost instantly. But this time, it wasn't a paragraph. It was only a few words, and those few words made them sit completely still. The words were simple, but they landed with a weight neither of you could have predicted. Your soulmate read them once, then slowly lowered the phone, staring into the distance as though they needed a moment to understand what had just happened. After all the hesitation, all the deleted messages, all the careful attempts to protect their feelings, your response had reached the exact place they had been afraid to expose. And suddenly, the uncertainty that had followed them throughout the day became quieter. They weren't looking for a perfect answer anymore. They weren't trying to predict the future. They were simply grateful that the conversation had finally begun. Then they picked up the phone again and typed something they had never been able to say so directly before. This time, there was no complicated explanation. No carefully constructed excuse. Just a truth that had been waiting underneath everything else: I don't want to keep pretending this doesn't matter to me. For the first time that day, they didn't look nervous. They looked relieved. They understood that meaningful connections aren't always defined by dramatic moments. Sometimes they're defined by the courage to finally stop hiding behind uncertainty. Your soulmate thought about every little moment that had brought them to this point, the conversations that lasted longer than expected, the unexpected smiles, the quiet pauses, the memories that kept returning when they least expected them. None of those moments had seemed important enough on their own. But together, they had created something impossible to dismiss. And today's event had simply made them notice it. They realized they didn't need to know exactly where this conversation would lead. They only needed to be honest about where they stood right now. That honesty changed the atmosphere completely. The conversation became lighter. There was even a moment when both of you found yourselves smiling at the same time, separated by distance but connected by the same realization: neither person had imagined the importance of this connection alone. Then came the message that gave the entire day its meaning. Your soulmate told you that if they could go back to the moment when they first realized you were different, they wouldn't ignore that feeling anymore. They would pay attention. They would ask the questions they were too hesitant to ask. They would say the things they kept postponing. And then they admitted something surprisingly beautiful: they weren't asking you to erase the past or forget every difficult moment. They simply wanted the chance to create something more honest from this point forward. That was the important message hidden inside everything that happened today. Not a promise that everything would magically change overnight, but an invitation to stop letting fear write the next chapter. As the conversation continued, your soulmate looked at the clock and realized how much time had passed. They smiled at the screen and whispered to themselves, "I should have said this sooner." But before they could put the phone down, another message arrived from you, one that opened a completely unexpected door. And this time, what you asked them wasn't about the past at all. It was about what they wanted to happen next. The question made them pause longer than any message before it. Not because they didn't know the answer, but because they suddenly understood how much that answer mattered. They looked toward the window, watching the evening settle over the city, and thought about how different they felt compared with a few hours earlier. This morning, they had been carrying uncertainty. Tonight, they were carrying possibility. Your question had given them an opening they hadn't known how to create for themselves. They could have answered carefully, keeping everything vague, but something inside them had changed.